Hi, I'm Jennifer Brown, and on behalf of the Center for Literary Arts at Frostburg State University, I'd like to welcome you to the 15th Annual Western Maryland Independent Literature Festival, and especially to this event with Tony Russo. Before we talk about Tony, I'd like to thank the sponsors who make our work possible: the Allegheny Arts Council, the City of Frostburg, Savage Mountain Punk Arts, and several offices at Frostburg State University, including the Office of the President, the Office of the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Department of English and Foreign Languages and Literature. Telling compelling stories about ordinary people has been Tony Russo's specialty for the entirety of his journalism career. Whether profiling artists, community leaders, or combat veterans, he has a knack for helping people connect to personal stories. In addition about writing about the craft beer revolution, Tony wrote and hosted This Is War, a narrative podcast documenting the personal stories of combat veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. His most recent work, Dragged into the Light, Truthers, Reptilians, Super Soldiers, and Death Inside an Online Cult, looks at how one nondescript woman was able to tap into the rising paranoia that birthed the conspiracy theory culture. I'll also say that Tony writes a fascinating blog. In a recent post that I read, he writes about writing letters, which is a hobby that I too hold dear. Tony lives on the Eastern Shore of Maryland with his wife and their 4 daughters, or one of his 4 daughters who's yet to move out. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Tony Russo.
So I just start talking. I'm so sorry. I feel old when the technology is just a half a step ahead of me, because this is also what I do for a living. So that's embarrassing. Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and I'm here to talk about my work as a nonfiction author, creative nonfiction author. One of the things that has always been a useful tool for me is conducting good interviews beforehand. The idea of talking to people. So in my most recent book, I talked to a lot of conspiracy theory believers. And now these are people who believe that the president is literally, wearing human skin and being a reptile underneath. They believe in a lot of different perceptions of like the divine. So they believe that they're in a war with the devil, and that war is taking place here on earth. There are a couple of examples that you may have been more likely to hear of. The man who blew himself up on Christmas Day in Nashville was out fighting devils in our world at the time, and the Christian surf school teacher who recently killed his 2 children because they were reptiles are also believers in this kind of conspiracy. And what's difficult when you're talking to people who are just living in a different reality from you is to take them seriously and to be empathetic. It is very, very hard to reserve judgment when people are saying, well, no, I knew that I would be arrested for killing my children, but I was serving a higher purpose. And to talk to a person like that, you need to be able to more than stand in their skin. Like, you need to be able to see the world from their perspective. And I think that some of the success that I've had in doing that has been being able to just suspend judgment. And suspending judgment, I think, requires you to accept that everything they believe is true, and not that they believe that it's true. Not just that they believe what they're saying, but for me to also believe what they're saying. What does it take? What does it take to drag someone out of the house and kill them because you think that you're saving the world? And as horrifying as it sounds when I say it now, think of, there are some movies that I like to use examples of. They're older movies, so I apologize. But think of the movie The Omen, or think of the movie with Christopher Walken. It was the Dead Zone, or the Stephen King book, The Dead Zone. At the end of The Dead Zone, the protagonist tries to shoot a senator because he knows that the senator is going to be at the center of the next world war, that he's going to destroy the earth by pushing a button. And this character knows it. And we also know it. We know it because we believe right along with the character the entire time that he has psychic abilities. And when he shoots the president or shoots at the president and then is killed himself, we know that he was trying to do the right thing, which was to kill this person. And we accept that. And the step between watching that as fiction and watching that as reality isn't a hard one to make. It's just an uncomfortable one to make. And being willing to be that uncomfortable to talk to people who believe, what are on the face of it, absolutely awful things, but be empathetic is a way that they will open up to you and give you more access to their world. And then when you have the obligation to kind of paint the way that their world is, you can do so with a little bit more authority. And that is one of the things that I learned by doing all of these interviews. I'm going to take a little sip here. Excuse me. The other thing that I found really useful was not conducting video interviews. When I started doing This Is War, which was the story about the combat veterans, the first two episodes we did, the first two interviews I did, we did via Skype, and where I could talk to the veteran, and then the veteran could respond to me. And right away, it was clear and they were good episodes and they were excellent interviews, and I'm not embarrassed of them at all. But it was clear to me that the face-to-face expectation is so much different than over the phone, or just the more confessional way to do it is not being able to see my face. He doesn't have to react, or she doesn't have to react to my reactions. I don't have to try to be impassive. And the other thing that's very useful when you're talking to someone on the phone, and it's something that's so much harder to do face to face, is to let there be a little bit of silence. When you're talking face to face, we use these cues to understand that, okay, now it's my turn to talk. Now it's their turn to talk. Now they expect me to talk, so I have to say something. Over the phone, that isn't an issue at all. Because if someone, it's actually the opposite. If I don't respond, then they will fill the silence for me or for them. And whereas when we're talking face to face, they finish their thought and they're like, all right, what do you think about that thought, is kind of what they say with their eyes. And then you say, this is what I think about that thought with your eyes. And then you say words. When you're on the phone, they just intimate, what do you think of that thought? And with your silence, you can say, I think that thought is incomplete. And that's the cue that they get by the silence. And then they'll go ahead and continue to speak. And doing This Is War it's probably the best work I've ever done, possibly the best work I'll ever do. I'm like, as far as being important, it's a document of a time. But as far as being a journalist, it really taught me so much about how hard it is to get quick interviews. The story was 45 minutes long. The episodes were about 45 minutes long. The interviews were at least 3 hours. And the reason that the interviews had to be 3 hours is the first half hour is them getting comfortable talking at all. And then the second half hour is them telling the stories that they've practiced in their head, and then after they get all of that out, they start to talk about how they feel. And when you engage with them and when you try to see how they feel the way they feel, it makes it easier for you to tell other people, like to make that switch between this is what I think of this conversation and this is what you should think of this conversation is very easy if you can adopt their perspective. But adopting their perspective can also be very, very difficult. It's time consuming. I'm going to take another sip, excuse me. And so with the recent book, the Dragged into the Light, I didn't have access to interview any of the people who were involved with the book. A brief synopsis. There's a cult leader. Her name is Sherry Shriner. And Sherry Shriner is only on the internet. No one goes to her house. She doesn't have a compound, but she has thousands, and by some reports, tens of thousands of followers online. And one of her foremost followers, one of her biggest fans, his name was Stephen Mineo. He met this woman, and her name was Barbara Rogers. And the shortest version is that in their religion, it's very much like Judaism. The religion runs through the woman. So a lot of times, if Sherry didn't think that the woman was on board, she would kick her out, or make the man choose between Sherry and being in the group. And when she did this to Stephen, he kind of lost his mind a little bit. No, I say he lost his mind a little bit because some of the things that he was already doing suggest that he was really already very close to the edge. I always like to say if he had survived, he would have been in Washington D.C. on January 6th. There's no question. Just to put a quick picture of him, he was 10 years younger than Barbara. He had lived alone his whole life. This is his probably first girlfriend, certainly the first woman he's living with. And Sherry texted him one day and said, Barbara is a reptile and she's going to kill you. And that's when Stephen lost control and he started attacking Sherry online. And about 2 months later, Barbara killed him. And that twist is the hook that everybody sees, and that's what makes it. Sherry Shriner said this woman was a vampire, super soldier, assassin, and that she was going to kill Stephen. She killed Stephen. Therefore, Sherry is a prophet. The story is much more complex than that. In the book I claim, and in real life I claim, I don't think what I say is there was a question about whether or not Stephen committed suicide or whether Barbara shot him. Both of their hands were on the gun when it went off. And what I tend to say is I don't think Stephen wanted to die, and I don't think Barbara wanted to kill him, but here we are. And I'm sorry, you were warned that this could get a little rangy. The reason that I told that story is since everyone was dead, I didn't have the same access to these personal interviews that I was used to when I was writing about an event. And for that reason, I almost didn't do the story. And then when I got the evidence from the police department, Stephen wasn't really a good typer. He didn't communicate well in print. So he recorded voice messages on Facebook for all of his conversations. So I went from knowing nothing about Stephen to hearing in his voice everything he thought for the final 2 months of his life. And again, as long as you accept that he meant what he was saying and that he believed it the way that you believe things that you believe, it was a lot easier to get. It was a lot more effective when I told his story, and I propped that up by, stories that I spoke with other people that I spoke with who were either in the cult or were friends of other people who had died as a result of the cult. And one of the things that was interesting when I spoke with the people who were outside of the cult, there was a young woman who committed suicide. And when I spoke with her friends, their utter bafflement is what made her story all the more compelling. And this woman, her name is Kelly Pengilly. She was 22 years old when she died. She'd been involved with Sherry for probably 4 years or so. And Kelly's run up to her suicide was the opposite of what you would expect. Kelly thought that she was a literal angel in the flesh, so that she had an angel soul, and she took her divinity seriously, but in a way that we don't usually associate with, people who think they're divine. Like, she went around like helping people Gandhi style, just, donating to the poor, volunteering at soup kitchen. She was just super, super, this is what God wants from me. And that was all well and good until she decided that God also wanted her to deliver the keys to hell. And that the only way to do it was through suicide. And I think, and everyone thinks, that she thought she was coming back. She didn't leave a proper suicide note. She's like, I'm going on an adventure. I don't know what's going to happen. And then she took a bunch of pills and died in the snow in Detroit, the suburbs of Detroit. And Sherry's response to this was to say that she was killed by NATO and by her parents. Her mother and her brother killed her and made it look like a suicide. And so when you hear these three stories and you believe all three, you can get at the kind of outrage of the survivors, the Kelly's friends and family. You can get at their outrage because you believe how little they believed in Kelly, but you can also get at Kelly's confusion by thinking about her genuinely believing that she had these missions. And then when you add in Sherry's other followers who believed Sherry when she said that Kelly had been murdered, you get how people are drawn to Sherry. Like, this is a person whose followers are being killed by the CIA with a frightening regularity. Then you're part of something important. You're not just lonely on the internet looking at kooky things. You are a soldier for God, and you are working in his name and honor to fight the devil, and you believe this. And accepting their belief of it has changed the way I think about belief in such an enormous way. And I think that it can help change all of our beliefs in that kind of way, the way we think about what we believe and why. A recent conversation that I had with my wife was about trying to make this point, because I've just been obsessing over this. Was I believe very strongly that vaccinations will be better than not vaccinations, that we would be in a lot better shape if we could convince everybody to be vaccinated. And I will do pretty much anything that I can to convince people to be vaccinated, because it's irresponsible not to, I think. Now, suppose you believe that about X. Suppose you believe that about, for example, abortion, that you have to protect people from making these awful, awful, awful decisions. And if you don't, you're being morally irresponsible. And when we can find a way to understand the people we're talking to by saying, okay, I accept and believe that you believe your beliefs, that you believe them as strongly as I believe mine, even though you're clearly wrong and I'm clearly right, that is a better way in for the kind of conversations we need to have more broadly. But also, as creative nonfiction writers, that is the kind of way into the subjects so that we can do a more authentic job in telling stories that we find repugnant. Because it only makes sense if you tell it right. Like, if you just say, hey, look at all these crazy people, it's not compelling. It's not interesting. And also it's not true. And so, you've kind of wasted your time. So you're going to get more color and more depth if you take the time to really get into your subjects, and not the facts of their lives, but the reality of their beliefs, and doing that by having these hard conversations and not pushing back. I mean, I'm going to take a drink. I'm going to tell you about a woman who saved the Super Bowl, and then we can move on to the next thing. Just a second. So I spoke with this woman who is identified in the book as MJ, and we spoke for, I think we had 3 long interviews. So probably we spoke for 4 hours all told, or so, maybe 5. And she told me things about her personal life that didn't make the book. I mean, she told me things about a personal life that didn't make the book, and I was uncomfortable representing. But the honesty in the way she related things was the key to understanding what she believed. And I want to tell you this story about her, and so you can get a sense at her depth of belief. So Sherry decided that the Super Bowl was going to be blown up, and I believe this was in 2012. And it was in New Orleans for sure. And so she needed someone to go and protect it with these special orgone rocks that they make for demonic protection. And MJ volunteered because she lived in Louisiana. So she got a bunch of these rocks, and she went to the Superdome, and she put these rocks all around the Superdome, in the parking lot, as close as she could get to the building, outside around the gate. She put orgone, it was the rock, all over this place. And if you've watched the Super Bowl every year, then you'll remember the year that the lights went out. That was this year. So Sherry had predicted that the Super Bowl would be blown up. And then this woman went to protect it. And then instead of blowing up, there was just a blackout. And how do you not believe after that? If you believe you're going to prevent something and then something almost happens, it's really hard not to think you didn't have something to do with it, especially when you have this belief. So I imagined what would happen if that had happened to me, because we all have these moments of superstition where we're like, wow, did that really work? Like, did not changing my left sock for a week really make me hit all those home runs? I mean, no, it didn't. But what I think it's Thomas Jefferson, right? It's superstition is foolish, but no one was ever hurt by not walking under a ladder. Once we grab onto these things, we can believe it. And the other thing I wanted to say real quick that I picked up from fiction, there's a specific story that I wanted to talk about, and it's a Stephen King story, and it's called The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet. And it's about a guy who loses his mind. It's about going mad. But one of the things that the characters said is that our minds are like an empty room with a loaded pistol in the middle of it. And when we do something like walk around a ladder, we open the door and look inside. When we do something like, try to get other people to avoid the ladder, we pick up the gun. And then when we start writing letters to the paper about how the ladder menace is causing a tax deficit, we put the gun to our head. And then after we pull the trigger, we run around town knocking down all the ladders. And that metaphor works so well for understanding how people I'm asked often in interviews, how do people get into this belief? And it's not like learning your times tables where you go and you remember it. Something happens and that is evidence. And then something else happens and that is evidence. And the more that you look for magical evidence, the more magical evidence you're going to find. And we all do it. That is the key. Isn't that they do it. The key is that we do it. And if you can see yourself in your subject, you're going to get so much more out of an interview, even if it's not about something horrible. It can be about something nice, but the conversation has to be about accepting their worldview and learning from it so that you can explain it in a way that makes them sympathetic instead of the butt of some joke. Does anybody have any questions about the interview thing before I go ahead?
Tony, let me just hop on here quickly. So there is a question in the chat. Considering the subjects you interview, have you ever felt afraid for yourself or found yourself caught up in a subject's paranoia? And then there's a follow-up remark, which is, I love how you highlight how circumstances can verify what we think of as a prophecy or superstition.
Yes. Thank you very much. I've never been afraid of these people. You know, there's I also wrote a story about this. The closest thing I got to a threat was someone bringing up Elijah and the bear, which is a Bible story from the Old Testament. And it was one that Sherry Schreiner's followers like to use as, you know, veiled threats. And it is just the Biblest of Bible stories. So in case you're not familiar with it, I'll tell you as briefly as I can. There was this guy, his name was Elijah, not the J one, the H one. No, the S one. And he was walking along and he was coming toward this city, and the people saw him, and he was this famous prophet, and all these kids came out of town and like, get out of here, Baldy. We don't want you around here, Baldy. And so then Elijah cursed them. And then 2 bears came out of the woods and killed all 50 children. The end. Good night, everybody. And so that was their veiled threat, is always like, if you mock the prophet, God will kill you with bears. So that was the closest thing I ever got to a threat. And I took it, you know, I took it as I got it. The other question about not getting dragged into the paranoia, early on in my research, I wanted, so spoilers, Sherry Schreiner died. She was dead before I got there. So she died before I took up my research. She died in 2018. It's not a huge plot point, but it's something that people ask, because I would not be convinced that this woman wasn't dead. I bought into this. I invented and bought into the conspiracy that after the heat got turned up because the prosecutors were looking for her, that she faked her death. And since no one had ever seen her, and since she only existed on the internet, she was alive someplace. And I wasted a lot of time. Eventually I paid the $25. I got the death certificate. I could have done that on day one, but it was so much more entertaining, and it was so much more compelling to look for, no, wait, she's hiding, she's dead. Everyone accuses everyone of being in the CIA and the conspiracy world. Another story that I was working on that I ended up not doing for this podcast was about a West Coast cult called the RSE, the Ramtha School for Enlightenment. And I had spoken with a lot of the people who had splintered off, and they said, this guy is, she's the cult leader is essentially a CIA agent. And their evidence was one of her right-hand men was a top general in the army. And, he left the army to be with her, to run her thing. So he was a CIA guy. And then I checked, and he was in the army, wasn't he? And I spent probably a week longer than I should have entertaining the idea that this woman was a CIA plant, only because it was more fun. I mean, it was more fun than saying, no, this is a woman who's just stealing from people who don't have enough money to pay her. That's less fun. That's boring. And it's horrible. It's horrible to think that one person would be that mean for money. It's fun to think that the government would be that mean for money. It's exciting. That's movie stuff, but just one lonely woman, shouting in the wilderness because she doesn't want to get a day job. It's boring. And my mind decided that. I didn't decide that. My mind was consumed by this idea that the CIA was somehow involved. And when I caught myself, it was so embarrassing. And there was just this moment where I was like, what are you doing? This is dumb. You're stupid. You got caught up in it just like they did. But I didn't get caught up in it day one. I got caught up in it, day 50 after looking, when you stay in this world long enough, it looks like it makes a lot of sense. Is that a satisfying answer?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So you did earlier mention that we all do this. We all the more we look for magical evidence, the more we find it, which is a great line, by the way. But there's another question, which is there a certain type of personality that tends to be drawn into conspiracy theories or cults, or do they run the gamut?
I don't know. I don't know personality. I know. I know like archetype. There are certain archetypes that tend to be drawn into this cult, but I think that the reason is because we have archetypes of people who are drawn into cults. I think we're kind of reverse engineering that. So I'm sorry. So the short answer is no. The little bit longer answer is to think about people who don't believe necessarily in conspiracies, but who, are very, very suspicious of the government. And, you might be one of them. I might be one of them. I am one of them. Right. And so we all have to parse this information, but it is exhausting. And sometimes it's just easier to listen to what someone else says, to just accept it and repeat it. And so that is, that's where the danger is. I don't think that's a novel thought at all. But that's what we have to take seriously. So Sherry's people, and the hardcore conspiracy people, and I'll go ahead and I'll say the reptile people are a harder core brand of conspiracy than other. If they have anything in common, it's that they are very religious. They're conservative religious people. And this is something that's demonstrated. There have been stories other than mine about this, but after 9/11, there was this real anticipation that the world was over, and word got out from quarters unknown that the world would end 10 years after the September 11th attacks. So that's how people believed. And then the world didn't end. And so a lot of people who were in what I like to call like normal, religions, normal conservative religions. So like Baptists or Seventh-day Adventists, we think of them maybe as a little far right, but they have names. They're not just broad evangelical. These are churches that have names and larger national affiliations. People started leaving because there wasn't the apocalypse that they were promised, and they were looking for someone who could promise them more information about the apocalypse. And one of the gentlemen I interviewed, who was a practicing Baptist, but also Sherry Shriner conspiracy enthusiast and a supporter of Sherry's, he said to me, it was just the most wonderful thing. He said, well, you can't go to your pastor and say, what do you know about the reptiles ruling the world? They don't teach that in seminary. And I thought that kind of captured the transition from conservative religion to conspiracy theory. This idea that the Catholics always do it the best. This idea of occult secret knowledge, this secret knowledge that's passed on from person to person instead of just spread out there for anybody to get. And for people to get their hands on this idea of occult knowledge and to combine that with what they already know from their, conservative religious beliefs, it's not a hard jump. It's not a weird jump. Again, the guy who killed himself, the guy who killed his children, he was a popular person in his church. He belonged to an evangelical church, very, sunshine and lollipops and guitars on Sunday. And there was this great story, I think it was on Vice, about the preacher's next sermon after that, and he started calling out people in his congregation. He's like, I know he wasn't the only one who follows this kind of stuff in here. You guys are on a really dangerous path. And there was a story in the Guardian back when I was doing my research. So this is 2019, maybe 2020. That said that there is this bleeding from the more conservative arms of all religions into this conspiracy thinking, because, the only thing that's been successful is the deterioration of authority, and authority hasn't really done anything in its own defense. So it's not like it's hard to feel bad for them. But that's once you spend your entire life looking for moral authority, when you realize that you can make it yourself, things can get dicey. And that's really the kind of personality that's involved here. There aren't a lot of neurosurgeons who are conspiracy theorists, but there are a bunch of lawyers. I guess maybe that's that's the line. Lawyers and on down, I guess.
So someone else asks, is there a dream conspiracy story that you've yet to write about?
Yes. And I'll tell it to you because I really hope to write about it. I'm working on a different book now. I'm working on a combat veteran book now. And then the next thing I hope to do, and you can look it up online if you care to, because there's an amount of it. It's a man called Clyde Hood. And he said that he was an international banker and that God had told him to stop helping international banks and start helping the little guy. And he had this plan. It was essentially a Ponzi scheme. That it was a one-way. I'm sorry, it was essentially a one-way Ponzi scheme. It was a 500 for one return. And what I love about this story, and if you get to it first, feel free to write it, because as long as someone should write it, it has. I don't know if you remember the movie The Informant. It was based on the ADM scandal from the late 90s, I think. And this guy was undercover in his own life, reporting on ADM, and he was just so overwhelmed because he wasn't qualified for it. Well, in this case, the perpetrator hoped to make maybe $300,000. He was, he's a retired electrician. He wasn't an international banker, and he hoped to make maybe $300,000. So he went to all of these evangelical churches out in the West and said, "Hey, I've got this 500 for one thing. If you send $100, we'll give you back 5,000." And instead of getting $300,000, he got like 36 million. And people were just doubling up and tripling up and sending him money wrapped in aluminum foil via FedEx. And he didn't know how to launder money. He didn't think he was going to have to launder that much. So he started doing these loans, these non-interest bearing loans to his friends. And this is a little town in Illinois. And all of a sudden, like, everybody has a boat. Everybody's opening a new business. Like he was his own economic development commission. And then he got caught and things went crazy from there. But that's, I love that story. It's because I've spoken with some of the people who contributed, and they believe that he was, murdered by the government, and he was murdered by the government to take advantage of the fact that they had already donated, so they won't take their money back. Like the IRS said, you were scammed, here's your $10,000 back. And they said, no, you're just trying to trick us and cut us out of the 5 million you're gonna owe us after the economic collapse. And that aspect of it is just like, who wouldn't take their money? How much do you believe in something that you won't take your $10,000 back from the government when they say you have been defrauded? How much work do you have to do to say, no, the IRS is just trying to scam me personally? The government is trying to cheat me out of my 5 million by giving me 10,000 that was stolen to me. it's beautiful. It's a beautiful story, and that's a little bit more fun, because there aren't any murders. Murders are worse than just fraud, I think.
It's just an incredible story.
It's wonderful. You can look them up, Clyde Hood. There have been a couple of long form pieces on it. I have a source. I'm working on a source, and if I get the source, then I'll have something new to say about it. And if I don't, then I won't. And that's the worst part. It's just as simple as that. There's this man. If he decides to talk to me, I get to have a book. If he decides not to talk to me, I don't get to have a book. And that's a place where nonfiction kind of departs from fiction in a real way. Like if you're fortunate enough to be good at writing fiction, then nothing can stop you. But I'm literally stopped by this old guy in in Mattoon, Illinois, who's like, I don't really want to talk about that anymore. I'm like, yeah, you should though, because it would make me happy. So I'm selfish about it as well.
So we're kind of coming up against our time boundary, but I did just want to remark that my saying that this conversation could get rangy maybe did just happen, but I think the best conversations get rangy. So I'm grateful for that. There is a quick question. Have you interviewed the victims who didn't want to get their money back?
Yes. I've spoken with two of them. One of them was like a retired waitress in Chicago, and she believes that there's going to be an economic crisis and that all money is going to be invalidated. This also ties in with Bitcoin now, which is why it would be a fun story to do sooner than later. But yeah, no, she wouldn't take her money back. And when there was a financial crisis, the most recent one, I want to say it was maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there was like a blip. And she sent me an email. She said, see, it's coming. And, it didn't come, but I'm sure she's waiting for the next one. I think that they're saying there's going to be a stock market correction soon. So maybe I'll get another email.
That probably puts us at our end point. But Tony, thank you so much for
absolute pleasure.
Fascinating conversation. I put the link to the book into the chat. So if anyone's looking for that, they can find it very easily. And I'm sure that we'll be looking for the next book to come out soon.
Fingers crossed, maybe this time next year. Maybe we'll do a book a year.
But thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.